screen to help keep museum programs like this one accessible to all. That's giving.uoregon.edu/MNCH-gift. Your donation directly supports the museum's educational programming, bringing science and culture adventures to Oregonians of every age and in every corner of the state. Thank you. Before we get started, I have a few museum updates to share with you. The museum is open. Our current hours are Thursday, 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Friday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. I want to encourage everyone to pop in for a visit and experience Racing to Change, Oregon's Civil Rights Years, the Eugene Story, before its last day on September 19th. We developed the Eugene Story version of this exhibit in partnership with Oregon Black Pioneers, whose executive director you'll meet shortly. If you're not local, we do have an online version of the exhibit, which you can find by visiting our website, mnch.uoregon.edu. Then in October, we'll be opening our new exhibit, Magic in Medieval Europe. This exhibit explores magical thinking in the past and present, and is sure to be a lot of fun. We'll have a member preview on Friday, October 22nd, and a public opening on Saturday and Sunday, October 23rd and 24th. If you're not yet a member, or if you've let your membership lapse, visit our website and join today. Finally, I hope that you'll join me next month for another Ideas on Tap. In anticipation of our new exhibit, on Wednesday, October 6th, I'll be joined by Martha Bayless, University of Oregon folklorist and curator of the Magic in Medieval Europe exhibit. Martha will explore the surprising history of medieval magic, including the origins of our modern-day Halloween traditions. If you can't join us live, recordings of our virtual talks are posted to the museum's YouTube page, so be sure to check it and any other talks that you've missed out. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Zachary Stocks. Zachary is a public historian, museum professional, outdoor educator, and historical interpreter. His work focuses on 18th and 19th century America, with particular emphasis on African American history and the history of westward expansion. Zachary is currently the executive director of Oregon Black Pioneers, as well as a ranger at Lewis and Clark National Historic Park. He joins us this evening for a discussion about the significance of the steamship Brother Jonathan in Oregon's Black history. Welcome, Zachary.
Thank you, Lauren, and hello, everybody. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here. Great. So once again, thank you so much for having me tonight. My name is Zachary Stocks. I'm with Oregon Black Pioneers, our state's only statewide African American Historical Society. And I also would like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you tonight from the ancestral homelands of the Clatsop, Nehalem, and Chinook peoples. And I'm very grateful to be here speaking with you from that place. And this is also a really unique opportunity to get to talk about this topic. I spend most of my time at Oregon Black Pioneers teaching people about the history of Black exclusion, or about the Oregon Trail, or about the development of early Portland. So this represents a really different topic for us, and it's one that there's still so much more to learn. So I'm pleased to share the first findings that I could come up with on this topic with you. It's sort of at the intersection of both the work that I do around Oregon's African American history and also a personal passion of mine, which is maritime history. I dig the boats. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So the Brother Jonathan was a steam-powered ship, a barkentine specifically, built in Brooklyn, New York in 1851. The name comes from an Uncle Sam-like character, which was used in early political cartoons, meant to represent the United States among the family, so to speak, of the British Empire, just as John Bull represents England. Now, at the time, the Brother Jonathan was, the fastest way for travelers in the eastern United States to be able to reach California and the Oregon Territory was still actually to travel by boat. Passengers would board steamships in the East Coast cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and then sail to the Gulf Coast of Panama. And from there, they would be escorted across the Isthmus of Panama, because there was no Panama Canal yet, along with their goods to the Pacific side, where they would board a second ship, which then transported them to the United States West Coast. Brother Jonathan served as one of the East Coast transport vessels, so it ran the eastern leg on the Atlantic side. It was very fast, and on its very first run, it set a new record time for the round-trip voyage from New York to Panama, which was 31 days. 31 days. Now, in 1852, Cornelius Vanderbilt, then the wealthiest person in America, purchased Brother Jonathan, and he shipped it around Cape Horn at the tip of South America to become part of the Pacific ferry fleet. So doing the same trip, but now doing it on the Pacific side. Vanderbilt negotiated an exclusive contract to transport people and goods across Nicaragua and then onto the United States Pacific states and to Western Canada. The plan was to move people through a large lake and then a series of rivers. It was complicated. But when this contract was canceled in 1856, the business venture failed. Vanderbilt then sold Brother Jonathan that same year to a San Francisco ship captain who renamed the vessel Commodore and used it as a West Coast passenger vehicle. It was also an important means of transportation for American and foreign fortune seekers to reach Canada's Fraser River during British Columbia's gold rush in 1858. Commodore also had a contract to transport mail from San Francisco to Oregon and to Washington Territory. And it was actually aboard Commodore, AKA the Brother Jonathan, that carried the news that Congress had ratified Oregon's statehood. The statehood bill was signed by President James Buchanan on February 14th, 1859. And from there, the news was sent by telegram to St. Louis, then carried by wagon to San Francisco, and then sent as mail to Oregon aboard the Commodore. And so on March 15, 1859, the vessel docked in Portland and delivered the news to Oregonians that they had been part of a US state for the past month. And in 1861, the boat was sold once again, this time to the California Steam Navigation Company, which renamed the vessel back to Brother Jonathan. Its regular route was from San Francisco to Victoria, BC, with stops in Crescent City and Portland along the way. If you know anything about maritime history, you should know that it's always bad luck to rename a vessel. Just keep that in mind. On July 30, 1865, Brother Jonathan left Crescent City for Portland on what would become its final voyage. About an hour after departure, the weather became incredibly dangerous. After making it as far north as present-day Gold Beach, Oregon, the captain determined that it was not safe to continue. Curry County, Oregon had less than 500 residents at the time, and there was no safe harbor on the Chetco River for the ship to anchor. So the crew had no choice but to turn back toward Crescent City. As the ship sailed south, it struck an uncharted rocky outcrop south of the Oregon-California border. The damage was severe, and Brother Jonathan began to sink immediately. Although there were enough lifeboats for everyone on board, only 3 of the ship's lifeboats could be launched in time. Of these, only 1 made it to shore, landing 8 miles below what is today the town of Brookings. Everyone else aboard went into the stormy ocean waters. The 19 people on the lifeboat reached shore were the only survivors of the wreck. The other 225 passengers and crew aboard Brother Jonathan that day died. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in American history up to that point. Now, outside of treasure hunters, this is where most public interest and knowledge of Brother Jonathan ends. But this overlooks a really fascinating connection between this ship and Oregon's 19th century Black community, and the West Coast Black community, actually. When searching for information about Oregon's Black history, Brother Jonathan makes appearances in multiple sources. Because of this, the weight of the 1865 disaster was likely felt in deep and unique ways by Black Oregonians, as they shared memories and experiences with this ship. In this way, Brother Jonathan is a cultural touchstone, which represents Black Oregonians' quest for freedom and opportunity and the sacrifices they made to obtain it. So a little bit of history to tell you where we are in time. In the late 1850s, pro-slavery advocates and Southern sympathizers in the California legislature began imposing new legislation meant to curtail the rights and residency of Blacks in California. These were mimicking directly Oregon's earlier Black exclusion laws. In 1858, J.B. Warfield of Nevada County introduced a bill to prohibit people of African descent from coming to California and required all existing Black Californians to register themselves and carry identification papers at all times. Those who could not produce papers on demand were liable to expulsion or forced labor. This law was heavily influenced by the success of Oregon's Black exclusion laws in 1849 and as part of the Oregon Constitution adopted 1 year earlier. Though the California bill failed to make it out of committee, many local Black leaders saw this as a sign that they were not safe. Even in a free state like California, the Fugitive Slave Act and state bills like this were a threat to the lives of any person of African descent. Prominent leaders in California and Oregon began making plans to leave the United States. Some urged an exodus to Mexico or to Panama, but the US's recent victory against Mexico in 1848 led to some to fear that the US would seek to colonize these nations for new territories in a concession to Southern slaveholders. This had happened before in the Compromise of 1850 and then later in the Missouri Compromise and then Compromise of 1850. Eventually, everyone agreed on Canada, which had been free from slavery since 1833. Letters were written to James Douglas, governor of British Columbia, and the former chief factor of Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Vancouver in Oregon. Douglas himself had African ancestry, as his mother was a Black woman from Barbados. And Douglas endorsed the Black expatriates' plan to move to the new provisional capital city of Victoria and to the Gulf Islands. In spring of 1858, a community meeting was held at the AME Zion Church in San Francisco to discuss the plan to immigrate to Canada. In attendance was Peter Neglee, captain of the Commodore, aka Brother Jonathan. Neglee offered to transport anyone who desired to leave on his next voyage to Victoria. And on April 22nd, 1858, over 200 Black Californians took up Captain Neglee on his offer. Among them were some of the most prominent members of California's African American community, perhaps most notably Archie Lee, who just days before had been declared legally a free person in a challenge to the Fugitive Slave Act that was California's highest profile slavery case ever. After the delivery of the San Francisco Black expats to Victoria, Black Oregonians organized their own exodus. Some men drove cattle to British Columbia to raise money, while women and children took the Commodore, aka Brother Jonathan, to Victoria from Portland. While the number of Oregonian versus Californian expats is not known, it is estimated that 800 Blacks in all left the United States for British Columbia between 1858 and 1861. In the 1860 census, California had lost about 20% of its entire Black population from the previous census, and Blacks in Victoria counted for 25% of the new city's population. On screen there, you're looking at newspaper history, by the way, of one of the families that made this journey, where they call specifically taking the Brother Jonathan while the women and children were traveling, while the men traveled over land and the women and children took the Brother Jonathan. Over the next several months, expats in Victoria settled into their new life and encouraged others in Portland and in San Francisco to join them. BC was booming at this time thanks to the gold rush. And in their letters, the Black American expats reported on ample job opportunities and a lack of racial discrimination. A sizable group of African Americans settled on Salt Spring Island, where they bought cheap land and helped establish a small community of fishermen, cannery workers, and farmers. Governor James Douglas and a California immigrant named Mifflin Gibbs negotiated a path for immediate British citizenship for Black Americans who moved to BC. And that in a gesture of new patriotism, Black West Coast expats formed the first militia in British Columbia, the Victoria Pioneer Rifle Company, to protect against potential American incursions. So I want to state that because that's really important. Blacks from California and Oregon fled the United States to Canada, immediately became British citizenships in this British colony, and then formed the first militia, expecting that the United States would try to colonize Vancouver Island in order to expand slavery. Many Blacks still in Oregon heard these reports and followed those who had already made the move. In 1858, Portlanders John and Charlotte Dandridge moved to Victoria. When their daughter Cinda and her husband Abner Hunt Francis came to visit, they were amazed by the prosperous Black community of former Portlanders they saw there. Abner Francis and his brother Isaac ran a store in Portland, but were targeted for expulsion under Oregon's Black Exclusion Act of 1849. The expulsion was never carried out, in part because of a large petition signed by over 200 community members. But the experience soured the Francis family to Oregon permanently. In letters to his friend from Buffalo, New York, Frederick Douglass, Abner wrote of the opportunities available to Blacks on Vancouver Island. In 1861, he and Cinda boarded the brother Jonathan and moved permanently to Victoria. We don't know how many others were with him, but he was not alone in making this choice. Victoria remained a refuge for Black Americans for many years. One prominent family there was the Thacker family. Not much is known about them, but it is known that their daughter Louisa was born in Boston in 1849. Whether or not the Thackers had been part of the 1858-1861 exodus to Victoria is uncertain, but Louisa was living there in 1885 when she married Allen Flowers of Portland. Allen Flowers was born in 1847 in Columbus, Ohio. As a child, he went west to Sacramento with his family during the gold rush and found work in the San Francisco maritime trade as a teenager. Flowers worked as a cabin boy. Guess what ship he was a cabin boy on? The brother Jonathan. In 1865, during one of the vessel's regular stops in Portland, the 18-year-old Flowers decided to desert the ship and remain in Portland. It was a decision that saved his life. Just a few months later, the brother Jonathan was destroyed. As part of his work, the teenage Flowers would have been familiar with the Black community in Victoria. Whether he met young Louisa there is unknown, but the fact that he traveled to Victoria to marry her in 1885 suggests that there was communication between the Black residents of Victoria and the Black community in Portland. Perhaps Flowers' role as a cabin boy aboard Brother Jonathan made him a known figure in BC. It is possible that this vessel was the first thing the new couple had in common. After marrying, the couple relocated to Portland. Allen worked for Union Pacific Railroad and earned enough to support the couple and their growing family. The Flowers were active in the city's social and philanthropic circles. They were leaders within the Bethel AME Church, the Portland NAACP, the Williams Avenue YWCA, and Louisa was a member of the Old Rose Club, an early Black women's club that became part of the Oregon Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Allen organized a visit to Portland by Booker T. Washington and was appointed as the Oregon delegate to the Negro Farmers Caucus by Governor Oswald West. The couple purchased a home on East First Avenue. They also purchased land to construct a through road to Union Avenue, today Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, making them the first Black land developers in Oregon. As they became more successful, they purchased more properties to generate income from rent. In total, they would own 4 homes simultaneously, plus acreage near Mount Scott, where they grew fruits and raised horses. Together, this couple had 5 boys, several of whom became lifelong Portland residents and business owners, living in the homes their parents had purchased. Now, I'm stressing all of this because I want you to recognize that among the wealthiest, most successful class of Blacks in early Portland are people who have this connection to this ship and the experiences of the Black community in Victoria, BC, who have been brought to Victoria in many cases by this ship. Let's see. Now, when the Brother Jonathan went down in July 1865, most bodies were never recovered. A mass grave of 66 persons was made in Crescent City, though only 28 are named on a memorial there. The 225 casualties included an unknown number of Black men and women. The ship had a crew of approximately 50. Now, at the time, Black men were ubiquitous on steamships of the era. They worked as cooks and as waiters in the ship's dining halls and dining decks. They were stewards for the sleeping car berths. They were coal shovelers for the steam engine, and in some cases, cabin boys, a general service role for boys and young teenagers, as in the example of Alan Flowers. Exactly how many Black members of the crew there were of the 50 odd on board that day is unknown. The dead, whose bodies were recovered, included 2 men of the crew, later confirmed to be Black, a coal shoveler named John Clinton and a cook named Charles Law. Others are likely, however, race was noted only in the bodies which were found washed ashore. From the passengers, the number of Black dead is also unknown. The Oregon Statesman's correspondent in Jacksonville, Oregon, reported, quote, quite a number of colored men and women, end quote, who washed up on the beaches of Oregon's south coast in the days following the wreck. Several days later, the coroner in California's Del Norte County listed 9 Black or mulatto victims from the 34 which had washed ashore north of Crescent City, but below the Oregon border. The San Francisco Evening Bulletin later confirmed 4 Black victims who may or may not have been among the unknown Black or mulatto victims reported earlier by the San Francisco Examiner. You can see these are listed here, the names of the individuals who we know. Those 4 were a Mrs. Wendell and her child, and Mr. and Mrs. James Church, residents of Victoria, BC. It is noted that Mr. James Church was also found with banknotes in his pocket from the Bank of Victoria. In all, the Brother Jonathan's approximate 245 passengers included at least 18 Blacks, or about 7.5%. Blacks in Oregon represented just 0.3% of the population in 1865, and Black Californians were just 1% of that state's population. That means that even this low-end number of Blacks aboard the Brother Jonathan represent a disproportionately high number of Blacks relative to these states' populations, but it's perhaps more in line with the Black population of Victoria. We will never know who these people are or what the nature of their travel was, but clearly the Brother Jonathan was a sort of freedom ship for the Blacks bound for BC, even through the end of the US Civil War. And one thing I don't have a slide for, but I do want to mention, is that all the while as this is happening, there was an underground railroad that took place in the Pacific Northwest. And the only known incident where an enslaved Black person in Washington state lived during this time period was in 1860, when the enslaved servant of James Tilden, a young boy named Charles Mitchell, was found in Olympia by Black residents of Victoria. They saw him working there, and then they ferried him onto a different steamship, not Brother Jonathan, and then brought him to freedom. And it led to an international incident between the two countries, Canada and the United States. So that is actually a touch of Washington state history. And while Brother Jonathan was not involved, steamships were, just going to show what they represented in terms of transportation for Black people. And also the fact that Charles Mitchell was found by 2 Black men who were residents of Victoria, who were in Olympia on business, how they ended up in Victoria, likely on steamships also. And if they were there prior to 1860, it's very likely that they came on the Brother Jonathan. Now, interestingly, the one lifeboat which did make it to shore carried 4 African survivors. This was apparently the result of their heroism, that the Brother Jonathan had any survivors at all. On July 30, 1865, a soldier named Greenleaf Curtis, who was an eyewitness to the lifeboat coming ashore, wrote that its 19 occupants included, quote, 4 sailors, Negroes. The correspondent from San Francisco Evening Bulletin on August 3rd, 1865, called these survivors, quote, four colored seamen, end quote. It was reported that they helped push the lifeboat off and away from the sinking ship just before it went down, saving the lives of the others in the boat. Their exact names are not known, their exact names are unknown, leaving us to speculate about who from the crew list these Black men were. The memorial for the victims of the Brother Jonathan in Crescent City states, quote, to the four Black seamen who, through their heroics, saved 19 people from the Brother Jonathan, end quote. In truth, they saved 15 along with themselves, but nonetheless, this tribute to them is important. What is known about these men is that all four were formerly aboard a whaling ship captured and destroyed by the Confederate ship Shenandoah as part of the last violence of the US Civil War. Every source cites this, that they were all aboard one of the ships raided by Shenandoah. The Shenandoah was raiding commercial ships from Union states and destroyed over 30 New England whalers, including 7 in a single day in Alaska's Bering Strait in July of 1865. Those ships were plundered and their crews were taken prisoner. They were all then sent away aboard one of the ships, the Milo, to San Francisco, where 4 of those men ended up on Brother Jonathan 1 week later. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We also know that these men in the reports were called Portuguese later on. Now, some historians have latched onto this and have used this to suggest that their Black heritage was a fabrication. Now, I don't want to name names because this is going on YouTube and there's a lot of wonderful people here tonight, but I will say that when I, as a public historian working for a Black Historical Society, when I hear other professionals from historical societies tell me that a tribute to Black sailors is a lie, that makes me very skeptical. And so I decided that if this really was a fabrication, I would need to prove it or confirm the opposite. So I decided to start looking into this. Now, thankfully, the Nantucket Historical Society mentions in a couple of their sources that nearly every New England whaling ship would stop in the West African island chains of the Azores and or Cape Verde on their long journeys to the Pacific. They stopped here for food, fresh water, and for crew. The inhabitants of those islands were almost all Africans, ever since they were first colonized by the Portuguese in the 1500s. And it would have been home to a class of free Portuguese-speaking African sailors for over a century by 1865. As a matter of fact, Marcus Lopez, one of the first Black people to ever set foot in Oregon, himself came from Cape Verde. Now, the manifest of the Brother Jonathan's crew includes 3, quote, seamen with characteristically Portuguese names. There was an A. Gonzalez with an S in the end of Gonzalez, an L. Domingo, and a J. Silva. I decided that I was going to cross-reference these names in the crew manifest with all of those crew names archived in the New Bedford Whaling Museum's digital archive of sailors, specifically trying to place them on the crew list for one of the 7 New England whaling ships that were destroyed by the Shenandoah in July of 1865. Because if we know they were on one of those ships, then I can cross-reference all the names on those ships with the names of these characteristically Portuguese figures who were included in the ship's manifest of the Brother Jonathan. Now, those ships were the Susan Abigail, the William Thompson, Euphrates, Sophia, Gira Swift, Hector, Sophia Thornton, and Milo. So if anyone wants to do some of this research on your own, feel free to look up those ships. Now, thankfully, the New Bedford Whaling Museum's digital archive is incredible. And you can just do a keyword search for the names of a ship, the names of a specific crew, the places where the ships launch from, and by date as well. So I used all of these filters to try and find as many examples as I could of these ships, their crews during the 1860s, and tried to find these names among them. I could not place any of them to these ships conclusively. However, there were dozens of hits for these names among crews of other New England whalers during the 1860s, and nearly every one of them lists their birthplace as Azores or Cape Verde, and nearly every one of them are described as either Black or dark-skinned under the racial category. So while I could not say for certain that these men were on the crew of any of these 7 ships during the time when they were raided by the Shenandoah, each of these ships had someone with at least one of these names in it at some point in the 1860s, and all of them were Blacks from the Cape Verde or Azores island chains. So I can't say for certain that these 3 were 3 of the 4 colored seamen who survived, but I can say with confidence that those four Portuguese sailors were not white men from Portugal, as has been suggested by some sources that I have used for this program, and from historical people that I have spoken with who have told me with great certainty that they were certainly not Black. I dispute that. And the prevalence of Black African sailors from the Portuguese colonies of the Azores and Cape Verde on American whaling ships of the day is clear from my research. And it defies logic to me that if these sailors were white, that multiple eyewitnesses at the time that their lifeboat came ashore in the early reports in the days that followed would refer to them as Negroes. So to wrap this up, when the Brother Jonathan sank on July 30, 1865, it was not only a terrible loss of life, but it was also a loss of one of the most important vessels in the West Coast Black history. The ship was literally a vehicle to freedom for hundreds of Black immigrants, and a source of opportunity and hope for its employees, a chance for a new life after a terrible tragedy, and the scene of great heroism by Black sailors as new tragedies occurred. The collective memory of Black people from San Francisco to Portland and to Victoria all included experiences had aboard the Brother Jonathan, making it one of the few things that in my work I can point to as a shared symbol between these disparate Black communities. And so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you the stories that I'm just beginning to learn more about with the Brother Jonathan. I'm excited to continue to do this work. And if you believe in the work that we do, I hope that you will visit our website and consider supporting us and allowing us to do more work like this. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and rejoin all of you in the webinar.
Thanks so much, Zachary. That was excellent. I am going to recommend that you type that web address into the chat feature here on Zoom, so that anyone who wants to click on that link and can go donate to Oregon Black Pioneers can do so. And while Zachary is doing that, I just want to remind everybody that this is how you can ask questions. You can put it in the chat. You can put it in the Q&A. If you're tuning into the Facebook live stream, you can put it into the comments there. So far, we don't have any questions, so don't be shy. Type in your question. While we wait to see if anyone else has any, I'll go ahead and just start by asking what got you interested in, you mentioned at the very beginning that you're just interested in shipwrecks. What got you interested in shipwrecks?
Well, to clarify, I'm interested in maritime history. I don't have a particular affinity to shipwrecks, but shipwrecks are cool. But prior to working for Black Pioneers, I actually worked for the state ships of Washington State. So I got to sail across the West Coast and work from my home office to develop programs that would take place on board these 2 ships. So that included field trips for kids as well as public sailing experiences. We did costume interpretation and got to interpret a lot of history of early maritime exploration during the 1700s and early 1800s. In what are today the states of Washington, Oregon, and California. That touched a little bit on Black history, and it was a nice way to introduce me to the Pacific Northwest when I was still a real newcomer here.
Cool. We have had a few come in, so we'll go ahead and jump into some of the questions that people are asking. How many steamships worked the San Francisco to Portland to Victoria routes?
That's a good question. So I don't know the exact number, but there were several. The Brother Jonathan, or I guess at that time, the Commodore, was not the only ship that ran the Pacific route from Central America to take people to San Francisco. But the transport by steamship from San Francisco to Victoria did not begin until the Fraser River Gold Rush in the late 1850s. Prior to that, there was not regular transport between those two cities. Victoria was, if it had been founded at all, it was a frontier outpost. So it was still growing at that time. But there were other ships that also ran different legs to take people to Victoria during this time. I mentioned the ship that brought Charles Mitchell from the Puget Sound. That vessel was called, it might have been called the Atlantic, I'm not certain. But there were other ships that ran through the Puget Sound, for example, and different ones had different routes. So they may stop at different ports. But for almost the entire life of the Brother Jonathan, its trip went from San Francisco to Portland to Victoria.
So you said Brother Jonathan was one of the fastest on the East Coast. Did it keep up that speed on the West Coast? And how long did it take to get from San Francisco to Victoria by ship?
Oh, I could probably find the answer to that if I looked it up and got back to you. So I'm not sure offhand.
No problem.
But I can say that it was not in the best shape by the time it went down in 1865. So I doubt it was still, a real record keeper. It had a collision a few months prior to the shipwreck in the Columbia River on its Portland leg when it collided with another ship and had been repaired. Some people suggested that could have been the cause of, it's how easily it sunk once it hit those rocks. My primary source says that that's not the case, but nonetheless, it had been retrofitted many times. The technology had continued to improve throughout the 1850s and 1860s. So by the time it went down in 1865, it was an old ship. And as I understand it, the price for a ticket was pretty low, which may be why we see large numbers of Black Californians and Oregonians able to take transportation this way. Because it was not something that was too expensive. But its low cost probably also tells us that this was not a comfortable way to travel and that it was time consuming and not necessarily smooth sailing.
Are any of the Black victims of the wreck listed on the memorial in Crescent City?
Yes, the ones whose names that I read who were among the passengers. I don't think the known Black crew are listed there on that memorial. So it's kind of strange. I think several different organizations have put up different markers over the years at that site. And there are a number of people who are interred there as well. So it is a cemetery, but there's also a memorial. And the people who are buried there don't include only the people who were lost in the wreck. So I don't think that the names on that memorial necessarily are the best way to figure out who was lost. Instead, it's probably to look at the names of the known survivors who were counted as survivors from the 19 and then work backwards and know that everyone else had died. I'm hoping that with a careful look, I'll be able to better uncover who of these victims were people of African descent, but it's going to take some time.
Here's a question that you probably get asked a lot in your other talks when you're speaking as the executive director of Oregon Black Pioneers. Was slavery ever legal in Oregon, California, or Washington State?
Yes. Yes. So in Oregon, it was. And I'm not an expert in Washington or California history, but there is a history of slavery in both of those places, in both California, even during its statehood, and in Washington during its territorial days. But in Oregon, I can speak pretty clearly about this. Yes, we know that there were at least 50 people who were kept as slaves in Oregon. And if you include to that the number of people of African descent who were brought to Oregon on the Oregon Trail while still enslaved, and then not released from slavery until after they arrived in Oregon, that number might be much greater. But because we don't have a lot of documentation for that, it's difficult for us to enumerate. But the way that slavery was permitted in Oregon, if you go back to the 1844 Black Exclusion Law, in 1843, the Organic Codes of Oregon stipulate that Oregon would be a place that did not permit slavery. But then in 44, the first Black exclusion law that they passed said that any enslaved Blacks brought to Oregon would not have to be released from servitude for up to 3 years if they were women or 2 years if they were men. So right there, you have legal conditions established so that people could hold slaves in Oregon for at least 2 years and up to 3. And we do know for certain that there were a number of Black women who were held in bondage for far longer than 3 years, in some cases more than 15 years. And so slavery was absolutely a part of the history of the Willamette Valley, even if we don't hear about that very often, because on paper, going back to 1843, Oregon said that it would be a place without slavery, but that just isn't the case.
So you mentioned Oregon's one of the early Black exclusion laws. Would you mind just giving our people tuning in a very short explanation of the Black exclusion law that was in the Oregon State Constitution?
Sure. So let me start back at the first one if I can. So that one I mentioned first, 1844. So when that one was passed, it set the terms by which enslaved Blacks were allowed to be held in bondage in Oregon. And it said that after they were released from slavery, that Blacks would have 6 months to then leave the state. And if they did not, they would be whipped until they did. So physically punished until they were expelled from the state. And that was later repealed, the Lash Law provision. But what a lot of people forget is that before, even after it was repealed, they just substituted it with a provision that said, no, instead of physically beating Blacks, what we'll do is we will sell their services to the highest bidder to complete various public works projects until their debt had been repaid, and then we'll expel them from Oregon. So now a state which is saying that we will not permit slavery in Oregon territory, at the same time, they're establishing the rules by which people already enslaved have to abide by, and they can actually sell people. So that's from the 1844 law. In 49, most of that law is restrictions against Black sailors who come to port, making sure that they don't leave their vessel, and if they do leave the vessel, that their white captains would be responsible for their behavior. But it also says very clearly that Oregon is a place where Blacks will not be allowed to enter or reside in. It's very clear. And so that one is the one that was most significant during the Oregon Trail years, because it was in effect during the height of Oregon's massive migrations. So at a time when Oregon's population grew to its highest growth rate ever, the Black population actually went down in Oregon because the Blacks that were here became very marginalized, and there was no incentive for any new Blacks to arrive in Oregon because they weren't sure if they'd be allowed to stay once they got here. And then in the Oregon Constitution, which was voted on by the public in 1857, the vote was on 3 issues. 1, to accept the Constitution. 2, whether or not Oregon should become a slave state. And 3, whether or not Oregon should ban free Blacks. And so the voters decided, yes, we'll accept this Constitution and seek statehood. No, we will not allow slavery to exist in Oregon, but yes, we will ban free Blacks from coming to Oregon. And so that was also another sort of thing that seems like cognitive dissonance. Like, wait, you want to ban free Blacks, but you don't want slavery? And the reason why is that the presence of any Blacks in Oregon was seen as a threat to white supremacy. They had set up a dichotomy of colonized and colonizer, and Black people didn't fit into either one. And so even if they came on their own free will with money to become landowners here, that was a violation of their vision of yeoman farmers spreading out across the land and establishing a place just for them. They couldn't reconcile, how are we going to deal with these others that don't fit within the racial model we've created? And so they banned Blacks from coming to Oregon at all.
Thank you. Excellent explanation. And we've had at least one viewer also thank you for that explanation just now.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Someone is asking whether the Black community still exists in Victoria today, like if there is a sort of continuation of some of those first settlers.
Yes. And so it's funny, I've learned so much of this from visiting the website of an organization not too dissimilar from Oregon Black Pioneers. It is a BC Black Pioneers organization, and they have preserved a lot of these stories. And it's fascinating to me that it's common knowledge in British Columbia that James Douglas was a person of African descent. So after John McLaughlin, the founder of Oregon, or the father of Oregon, as everybody calls him, when he was forced into retirement, his successor was James Douglas. And so at this really crucial time in Oregon's history, the most powerful political and economic figure in the Pacific Northwest was a person of African descent. And he went on to become the first governor of British Columbia. And then he helped pave the way for over 600 Black people in like a 4-year period to immigrate to BC and become British citizens because they were escaping racism and the threat of being, trafficked under the Fugitive Slave Act. And so to me, those things are huge movements and really important moments in the history of West Coast history. But it feels like that is not information that people I talk to have ever heard about. And I hadn't heard of it until I learned about this from the BC Black History Society. And so there is still a community in Victoria of Black Victorian Knights, Victorians. I don't know the demonym. And as well as the Salt Spring Islands. Many of the first non-native settlers of the Salt Spring Islands were Blacks from California and from Oregon.
So we'll bring it back to the brother Jonathan a little bit. And we have a few minutes left. So if there's anyone out there who has a question that you haven't had a chance to ask, please do ask it now. Someone is wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the accommodations on board might have been like.
Yeah, so I read a little bit about this, and it looks like there would have been mostly deck seating within sort of covered areas. I don't know enough about steamships to know what they're really called, but sort of if you go on like a cruise today, there's like the Windjammer Cafe, right? So it's sort of indoor, outdoor spaces. So there would be deck seating like that. And then the higher classes had really nice cabins. And the lower class tickets had very small cabins and shared accommodations. It would have been rocking and rolling. It would have been probably a lot of bouncing around on the high seas and not a lot of luxury. So this was sort of like, as I see it, taking the Greyhound bus of the day, except there's only one Greyhound. It is like the bus Greyhound. And everybody knows about it. And so this is the ship that you take if you want to go to BC. And because there were so many people either making that migration to BC, or at this point were relatives with people who lived in BC who had made this trip before, or were going to visit what was a thriving Black community, this was the only way that you could get there affordably and in a reasonable amount of time, because there still wasn't really an overland trip that could take you there directly. And of course, Victoria is on Vancouver Island. So you have to have maritime passage at least at some point to get there. So it would not have been a nice trip, but it was the most cost-effective and best known way to get there for Blacks in California and Oregon.
Has there ever been any scavenger activity for the sunken brother Jonathan?
Yes. And that is a whole other story. It is really far removed from Brother Jonathan's Black history, so I didn't dig too deep into it. But when Brother Jonathan went down, it was carrying a lot of gold. And because of that, it has become a very famous shipwreck for treasure hunters. And there have been lawsuits over who has the right to salvage what is found in the Brother Jonathan, or if, can California or Oregon claim it because it wrecked right at the state border. So it's a whole thing. And that is way over my head in terms of, I don't know anything about treasure hunting. But yes, there's a lot of people that still go out and look for it. The actual ship itself, its remains have never been found, as far as I know. But they have been able to pinpoint exactly where it went down, and a lot of gold double eagles and things have been recovered. Some of the money were payments that were going to like the Warm Springs tribe, I think, or the Umatilla tribe in Oregon. These were payments that the U.S. government owed to these tribes, and the gold went down with it. So I think that the tribes should probably be entitled to some of that money if it ever gets salvaged. It's the things that were lost on that ship are really remarkable. And so the material culture that sits, in the ocean there would probably be really revealing about the people of the time and who exactly would have been traveling along on a steamship. But it's really hard to place any of those things with Black history. And because so little of it has been salvaged, it's hard to say whether or not there's anything of value for what we are interested in.
All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and leave it there. I want to thank, just kidding. That was just a question about the YouTube link. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We will be posting a recording of this to our YouTube channel. The link has just been dropped in by one of our staff on the chat within Zoom here. So check it out later. You can watch it again, share it with your friends. Thank you, Zachary, so much for giving us your time this evening. Lots of thank yous coming in from the chat too. So we can just imagine everyone giving you a round of applause right now.
Thank you, everyone.
And I hope that everyone will join us again next month and have a great evening.
Great. Good night, all. Thank you so much.